All right, so imagine this. You're trying to teach a computer how to tell the difference between a sea bass and a salmon.
Sounds pretty easy, right?
Well, yeah, that's the whole idea behind pattern classification, but it actually gets a lot more complicated than you think.
Well, it definitely does.
You've sent over some really interesting excerpts from Duda, Hart Stork's textbook on pattern classification.
It's a classic.
And we're going to dive deep into it.
Let's do it.
We're gonna unearth the core concepts, the challenge.
The head scratchers.
Yeah, and some really clever approaches in this field.
Absolutely.
So whether you're getting ready for a big tech meeting or you're just, curious about AI,
Or both.
this deep dive is going to give you a solid understanding of how machines are learning to see the world around us.
It's like giving them a whole new set of senses.
Yeah, totally. So let's start with the basics, feature extraction. It sounds kind of like a, high-tech spy operation or something, but
Right.
but what's actually happening here?
Well, think of it like a detective looking for clues, right? So if we want a computer to be able to tell the difference between a sea bass and a salmon, we have to find those telltale signs that make them different.
Okay.
And the book actually uses that as an example and talks about how sea bass tend to be wider than salmon.
Uh-huh.
And lightness is another big giveaway.
So we're talking about the key characteristics, the things that really make something a sea bass or a salmon.
Exactly. Once we figure out what those features are, we can represent them in a way that a mayor can understand.
Okay.
And we do that using points in a space that we call feature space.
Feature space.
Feature space.
Okay.
So think of it like a graph,
Okay.
where every single point is a fish,
Uh-huh.
and we're plotting it according to its lightness and width.
I got it.
That's feature extraction in action.
Okay.
Turning something visual into numbers a computer can actually work with.
So we've got our features, and they're all laid out in this feature space.
Right.
So now what? Do we just draw a line down the middle and say, okay, sea bass on this side, salmon on that side?
I wish it were that easy.
Yeah.
This is where things get really interesting and sometimes a little frustrating.
Okay.
Because we need to build a model that can use those features and then accurately classify new examples.
Right.
But the real challenge is building a model that can generalize well to data it's never seen before.
Right. And the book calls this the curse of complexity.
Yes.
And it seems like if you make your model too complex,
Mm-hmm.
it's really good at memorizing.
Yes.
But then it fails when you show it something new.
It's like a student memorizing answers for a test
Right.
instead of actually understanding the material.
Yeah.
They might ace that specific test,
Right.
but they're going to struggle when new problems come up.
Totally.
And the book actually illustrates this using figure 1.5.
Okay.
They show how an overly complex decision boundary can lead to misclassifying a fish
Okay.
that is very clearly a salmon,
Oh, so it's like a salmon, but it looks like a sea bass.
just because it falls on the wrong side of that convoluted line.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how do we find that balance of complexity? So it's complex enough, but not too complex.
Right.
And how do we even choose which model to use in the first place?
Yeah, there are so many omnivores out there.
Yeah, there are a ton.
And the book makes a really good point that there's no one magic formula.
Okay.
It's really hard to build a general-purpose pattern recognition machine
Yeah.
that can do everything.
Right.
Because the best way to do it really depends on the specific task you're trying to do and how much it costs to make an error.
So it's all about context.
Exactly.
Like misclassifying a fish at the supermarket is not as big of a deal as, say, misclassifying a medical image.
Exactly. The fakes are different.
Right.
And humans are really good at switching between those contexts, but AI is still working on that.
Yeah, it's true. Okay, so speaking of approaches, the book talks about three main categories: statistical, neural, and syntactic pattern recognition.
Right.
Syntactic pattern recognition, that sounds like it's right out of a linguistics textbook.
It is. This approach uses logical rules and grammars to describe those patterns.
Huh.
And that's super helpful for things like analyzing sentence structure.
Okay, I see how that would apply to language, but for our fish example, the statistical approach seems like the way to go.
You're probably right. The book focuses mostly on statistical pattern recognition, which uses probability densities to model patterns that are a little fuzzy because of random noise.
Okay.
And neural pattern recognition is closely related, but it has a different history.
So are we saying some of these models are more like nature and some are more nurture? Like some are built on these hard-coded rules and others kind of learn from experience?
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It
Yeah.
highlights just how complex pattern recognition can be, whether we're talking about humans or machines.
Right.
Now, the book also throws in another concept called evidence pooling.
Evidence pooling, RA, is this like when you have a bunch of witnesses who all saw the same event but give slightly different accounts?
Exactly. Imagine you have several different component classifiers,
Okay.
and they're all looking at the same fish.
Uh-huh.
Some say sea bass, others say salmon.
Yeah.
How do we sort through those conflicting opinions and make the best decision overall?
Right. You need like a robust voting system.
Yes.
But it can't just be like majority rules, right?
Right. Some classifiers are just more expert than others.
Right. Okay. So it's more like a panel of judges who each have their own area of expertise.
Exactly.
And we need to figure out whose opinion matters the most in each case.
You got it. And how we do that weighting can really change how well the whole system performs.
So it's not just about like building individual classifiers, it's about coordinating them into a team.
Exactly. A well-coordinated team.
Wow, okay, that brings us to another really important idea, Bayesian decision theory.
Yes.
Bayesian, didn't he come up with that famous theorem about probability?
The one and only. And this theory gives us a way to make the best possible decisions, even when there's uncertainty,
Okay.
by balancing what we already know
Right.
with the evidence we get from the data.
So it's not just about what we see, but also what we already know going into the situation.
Exactly. The book explains this with our trusty fish example.
Okay.
Deciding between sea bass and salmon can depend on the fish's length
Okay.
and how likely each type of fish is in that area.
Got it.
So let's say you're fishing in a spot known for salmon.
Uh-huh.
Even if you catch a shorter fish, you might still think it's a salmon
Because of what you already know.
because of what you already know.
Exactly. So we're adding context to the equation.
Yes,
It's not just about the measurements, it's about the bigger picture.
precisely. And that context helps us make better, more intelligent classifications.
Okay.
Now let's talk about another important concept, discriminant functions.
Okay. Discriminant functions are these like the bouncers at our feature space club.
Haha, I like that.
They decide who gets in and who doesn't.
I like that analogy.
Okay.
They are mathematical functions that divide feature space into decision regions,
Okay.
and that lets us categorize new patterns.
So it's like drawing lines in the sand.
Yeah,
Or in our feature space.
in our feature space, yeah,
Okay.
to separate the sea bass from the salmon.
Gotcha. So the book explores different scenarios,
Yes.
like when covariance matrices are different, which leads to some really crazy hyperquadric decision boundaries.
Right.
And when they're identical, which makes things simpler with linear or hyperplane boundaries.
Exactly.
Wait a minute. So the type of model we use affects the shape of those decision boundaries.
It does.
And if I remember correctly, that ties back into that model complexity issue we talked about.
You got it. It's all connected.
This is starting to feel like a real detective story. We've got our clues,
The Bayesian decision theory.
and we've got our suspect pool.
Decision regions.
But even the best detectives make mistakes sometimes, right?
True. And that brings us to the concept of error bounds.
Error bounds.
No classifier is perfect,
Okay.
but if we understand those theoretical limits, it helps us set realistic expectations.
So we need to accept that there's always a chance of getting it wrong,
Unfortunately, yes.
even with really sophisticated systems.
Even with the best systems.
Okay. So the book uses the terms hit rate and false alarm rate.
Right.
And I think I understand this correctly. So hit rate is how often we correctly identify a sea bass as a sea bass.
Yes.
And a false alarm is when we think a salmon is a sea bass.
You got it. And the key takeaway here is that there's a trade-off between these rates.
Okay.
The best balance really depends on the task and the cost of making those different types of errors.
So context is king
Context is king.
in the pattern classification world.
It's a theme that runs through the entire field.
Okay. And speaking of context, let's not forget that real-world data is messy.
Oh, it definitely is.
It rarely plays by the rules.
Right. What happens when we're missing some features or they're noisy?
Yeah, it's like our detective has a smudged fingerprint
Yes.
or a witness with blurry vision.
Exactly. Missing data and noise are the enemies of any pattern recognition system,
Whether it's human or machine.
whether it's human or machine.
Okay, so how do we deal with this? Do we just give up?
Not at all. We have strategies.
Okay, good.
We'll get into the specifics later, but generally speaking, for missing data, we can ignore it.
Okay.
We can try to fill in the gaps or use models that are designed to handle it.
Okay.
And for noise, we can try to filter it out or use models that are less sensitive to it.
So our detective might still solve the case even with some bad evidence.
Exactly.
This has been a fascinating dive so far.
It has.
I feel like I'm already starting to understand how machines make sense of the world.
Me too.
This is great. So what stands out to you so far? What are you most intrigued by?
Well, I think
It's funny, I used to think of pattern recognition as like this really mathematical thing, all equations and algorithms.
right.
But the more we talk about it, the more I see how it's kind of similar to how our brains work.
Yeah, especially that Bayesian stuff.
Yeah, it's like we're reverse engineering human thought.
It is fascinating how much of our own intelligence can we replicate in machines. But before we go too far down that philosophical rabbit hole,
Yeah, right?
Let's get back to those practical challenges we were talking about.
Yeah.
Dealing with real-world data.
Right, because data is hardly ever as count and organized as we want it to be.
Exactly. And the book jumps right into the issue of missing features.
Okay.
So imagine our fish is hiding behind a rock.
Okay.
We can't measure its width accurately.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle and some of the pieces are missing.
Exactly.
So what do we do? Do we just give up and say, well, we'll never know how wide that fish really was?
Luckily, we've got some pretty clever strategy. The book mentions a few approaches, like just ignoring the missing feature.
But isn't that kind of risky, like throwing away a clue?
It can be, but sometimes it's the best option, especially if you have enough other features to work with.
Okay.
Another approach is imputation,
Imputation.
which is using the data, you do have to estimate the missing values.
Oh, so it's like those crime shows where they use like facial reconstruction to figure out what a suspect looks like from a skull?
That's a great analogy. And just like in forensic science, there are different imputation techniques,
Okay.
each with their own pros and cons. The book also talks about using models that are designed to handle missing data without needing to do imputation.
So it's like having a detective who can solve a case even if some of the clues are missing.
Exactly. Okay, so we can deal with those missing pieces, but what about noisy features?
Right, the ones that are distorted or inaccurate, like a blurry photograph.
Yeah, or a garbled recording. It's like a witness who doesn't remember things clearly or gets confused about what they saw.
Right.
Noise can really throw off our classifiers, and we end up with inaccurate results.
So how do we get rid of the noise and find the truth?
One way is to use filtering techniques
Okay.
to clean up the data before we give it to our model.
Like enhancing a grainy security video to get a clearer image.
Exactly. We can apply similar techniques to our data to get rid of the noise.
But what if we can't completely eliminate the noise?
Well, then we can use models that are designed to be robust to noise.
Okay.
These models aren't easily swayed by a few messed up measurements.
So they're like detectives who can see through the inconsistencies in a witness statement and still find the important facts?
Exactly. So we have options. We can either clean up the data or use models that are less sensitive to the mess.
I see. Okay, but let's go back to that evidence pooling idea for a second.
Okay,
It still feels a little mysterious to me.
right. You remember we might have a bunch of different classifiers,
Yeah?
all looking at the same fish,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't always agree.
Right, like some might think it's a sea bass based on its width, and others might think it's a salmon based on its lightness.
Exactly. How do we combine those different perspectives to make the best overall decision?
Right.
It's not as simple as just taking a vote.
Right, because some classifiers are more reliable or more expert in certain situations.
You got it.
So it's really like a panel of judges, and we have to figure out whose opinion carries the most weight in each case.
Precisely. And there are a lot of different methods for weighting those opinions.
Okay.
And how we weight those opinions can have a huge impact on how well the whole system performs.
So it's like fine-tuning an orchestra to make sure all the instruments are working together.
Perfect analogy. Are there any specific methods that work particularly well?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
One of the most popular and powerful approaches is Bayesian belief networks.
Belief networks, that sounds kind of philosophical.
They are pretty elegant. These networks are graphical models that show the probabilistic relationships between different variables.
So it's like a map that shows how different pieces of evidence are connected and influence each other.
Exactly. And what's really cool about Bayesian belief networks is that they let us use both our prior knowledge and the data we observe.
So we can feed the network all the information we have about fish, like where they live, how big they are, their migration patterns, and use that to make better classifications.
Exactly. Belief networks can handle complex relationships between lots of different variables, which makes them really versatile.
Yeah, I see.
And because they're Bayesian, we can update our beliefs as we get more evidence.
This is starting to sound a lot like how our brains work.
It's a question that keeps researchers in AI busy.
Yeah.
While Bayesian belief networks don't perfectly mirror how the human brain works,
Okay.
they do offer a really structured way to model complex decision-making process.
Okay, my brain is definitely getting full.
I know it's a lot to take in, but it's all really important for understanding how machines are learning to deal with all the complexity of the world.
So where do we go from here? What else is there in the world of pattern classification?
Well, we've been talking about classifying things like fish, which are static objects.
Right.
But what about patterns that change over time?
Oh yeah, the dynamic world. Things are always changing.
Exactly.
And our classifiers have to keep up.
Exactly. And for those situations, we have another powerful tool, hidden Markov models.
Hidden Markov models. I've heard of those. Aren't those used in speech recognition?
You're exactly right. They're great for modeling sequences of events, like the words in a sentence or the notes in a song.
Okay.
They help us capture those temporal dynamics of pattern.
So instead of just classifying a picture of a fish, we could classify a video of a fish swimming and figure out what it's going to do next.
Precisely, hidden Markov models open up a whole new dimension of pattern recognition.
Wow.
They let us deal with the complexities of a world that's constantly changing.
And that's got to be really important for things like self-driving cars,
Exactly.
where the system has to analyze the changing environment in real time.
And make decisions in a split second.
Wow, this is incredible. We've gone from classifying still images to predicting future actions.
It is an exciting time to be working in pattern classification.
It feels like we're getting closer to those sci-fi ideas of truly intelligent machines.
It does. I think it's time to give our listeners a chance to catch their breath.
Yeah, we don't want to overload them.
Right? We'll be back soon to dive into even more fascinating aspects of this incredible field.
Stay tuned. All right, I think I've had some time to digest all those hidden Markov models and dynamic environments, and I'm ready for more.
Good.
What other pattern classification magic is there?
Well, we've talked about different models and techniques,
Right.
but now let's talk about something truly revolutionary.
Okay.
Algorithms that can learn and adapt all on their own.
The dream of AI, machines that can teach themselves.
Yes.
So no more hand coding all those rules and parameters.
Right.
We just give them tons of data and watch them become geniuses.
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
But the idea of self-learning algorithms is a big deal in AI research.
I bet.
And the book gives us a little taste of this by talking about genetic algorithms.
Genetic algorithms. So we're talking about survival of the fittest.
Uh-huh.
But for algorithms.
Yes.
It sounds like sci-fi.
It kind of is. The analogy is actually pretty accurate.
Okay.
Imagine a whole population of classifiers,
Okay.
each one represented by a string of bits, kind of like a chromosome.
Okay.
And these classifiers compete with each other.
All right.
And the ones that do the best on a task,
Uh-huh.
they're more likely to reproduce.
Hold on. How do algorithms reproduce? It's not like they can have babies.
Not literally, of course, but they can go through things like crossover and mutation,
Okay.
which are kind of like the processes of evolution.
Okay. I'm listening.
So crossover is like taking the best parts of two parent classifiers
Okay.
and combining them.
Right. To create a better offspring.
Exactly. Like breeding the fastest racehorses to get an even faster generation.
Wow. Okay.
And then mutation introduces random changes.
Right.
And those can sometimes lead to some really cool improvements because
Okay.
it's a random genetic quirk that gives a horse super speed.
It's amazing how we can take inspiration from nature to solve computer science problems.
It is pretty cool.
So are genetic algorithms actually useful?
Yes.
Or are they just like a theory?
No, they're definitely useful. They've been used to solve all kinds of problems.
Really? Like what?
Well, things like optimizing engineering designs,
Okay.
composing music, and of course improving pattern classification.
So they can help us find solutions that we wouldn't have thought of on our own?
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how powerful this could be. It's like letting the algorithms explore all these possibilities guided by evolution.
Yeah, it makes you think about what an optimal solution really means in pattern classification.
Yeah. Does an optimal solution even exist? It seems like the best solution really depends on the problem, the data, the cost of being wrong.
You've hit the nail on the head. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay, so the book talks about this thing called the no free lunch theorem,
Yes.
which sounds kind of ominous.
Right, like every choice you make in pattern classification comes with a price.
Yeah, kind of. It basically says that no single algorithm is better than any other.
Right, when you average over all possible problems.
So there's no magic bullet, no ultimate champion.
Unfortunately, no. But that doesn't mean we're just lost at sea.
Okay, good. So how do we deal with this no free lunch situation?
Well, the key is to really understand the specific problem you're trying to solve
Okay,
and let that guide your decisions.
got it.
You have to think about the type of data you have, how well you want it to perform, how much computing power you have, all those things.
So it's not about finding the best algorithm in some theoretical sense. It's about finding the best one for your specific situation.
Exactly.
Okay.
It takes knowledge, experience, and a willingness to try things out.
It's a journey.
It is. This has been a really cool journey.
It really has. I feel like I understand pattern classifications so much better now.
Me too.
We've learned about the basic ideas, the creative solutions, and all the challenges of this field.
It's a field that's always changing with new discoveries happening all the time.
Yeah, but the things we talked about today, those are the core principles.
They are.
And they're going to stay relevant as we keep pushing the boundaries of AI.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground, from feature extraction and Bayesian decision theory to hidden Markov models and genetic algorithms.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. I'm sure our listeners have a lot to ponder as they explore pattern classification.
I hope so. It's a field with so much potential.
Well, that's the end of our deep dive into pattern classification. Thanks for joining us on this incredible adventure.
It was my pleasure.